Welcome to the Wheats on Your Mind podcast. My name is Aaron Harries. Wheats on Your Mind is brought to you by the Kansas Wheat Commission and Kansas Association of Wheat Growers. Our guest on this episode is Jim Peterson. Jim is the North Dakota Wheat Commission's Policy and Marketing Director. Jim assists with three major program areas: export, marketing, trade policy and issues, and research customer service. His goals are to increase export and domestic sales, both in terms of volume and market share for U.S. hard red spring and durum wheat. Jim, welcome.
Thanks, Aaron. It's good to be here and chatting with our good friends in Kansas.
Well, review the wheat year for us so far. I know, we've had drought here in Kansas, obviously, this year, but you had your share of that a couple years ago with a pretty severe drought. Have you recovered closer to normal this year?
Yeah, there's, one barometer is the drought monitor. We have our northern part of the state that's still listed in drought, and then you kind of go to the northeast part of the state. They're still listed in a D3. And so for our region this year, it's been a relatively good growing season. I think the term we use is variability. We were a little bit late getting planted in some areas, and that was primarily due to just a pretty cold winter and kind of a late start to spring. Some areas were excessively wet going into planting, but probably the biggest thing was just kind of more of a cold spring. And then we cranked up the temperatures in June. June temperatures were well above normal, some stress in the crop, and a lot of agronomists were thinking, that's going to be a pretty negative on yield just because wheat is a cool season crop. June is kind of our primary part of the growing season. So essentially just less tillers and less kernel fill or a smaller number of spikelets per head. But then July turned cooler, and so that was beneficial. And actually, as farmers got into the field, the yields are coming out better than expected. Not double what they expected, but 10 to 15% higher. And I think we did get a lot of foreberry fill in some areas with the cooler temps in July. We didn't have disease pressure. When I talk about variability, the southwest part of our state, actually, they weren't in drought pretty much the whole growing season and received some pretty good rain. So those producers, a lot of them are harvesting some of their best crops ever, just tremendous yields, but we lost protein. Ironically, the eastern part of the growing region, eastern half of the state into Minnesota, was in somewhat abnormally dry throughout the whole season. But some of those yields have actually, like I said, come in better than expected, and they have protein to go with it. So, I think overall producers are pretty happy with this harvest. And like you said, certainly a big change from 2021, and we certainly feel for the fellow producers in Kansas. Drought is just a pretty tough cycle to get out of, fortunately we're looking at average to above average yields for most areas.
Maybe we ought to do a little bit of the North Dakota Wheat 101 refresher. So out of the 6 classes of U.S. wheat, you grow spring wheat and durum. Any other classes?
Yes, we also grow a hardwood winter, but so like this year, we planted about 6.5 million acres. A little over 5.5 million of that is hardwood spring, so that's by far our dominant. And then we planted 900,000 acres of durum. We're still the top durum producing state in the country, and followed by Montana. And then winter wheat really depends on the type of spring we have, or if we're able to get a good early harvest, guys will come in and put in winter wheat. Or like a couple years ago when, due to your unfortunate circumstances, with production, hardwood winter wheat prices were elevated at planting time, and so we did see a bit more. But typically right around 100,000 acres is all we plant of winter wheat. I think this year we're at 150,000. In 2011 and 13, when we had a very wet spring, and farmers had to take a lot of prevent plant. We did get up close to 700,000 acres of hardwood winter wheat that following fall, just because they wanted to get some cover on it before the winter.
Yeah, so ideally, I know you had quite a bit of snowfall that had to melt off this spring. Ideally, what are the ideal planting dates for spring wheat in North Dakota?
Well, I would say as you start in the southern part of the region, like parts of South Dakota, and then move north, we have had some planting as early as the latter part of March. But I would say mid-April through, the middle part of May is kind of the ideal time. For the majority of the region, final plant date for crop insurance in our northern counties is actually June 5th. So, farmers up that way, historically have planted after Memorial Day and still been able to pull off some pretty good crops depending on the growing season. But of course, the big risk you have there is if you would catch an early frost, or as the situation we are now, you get into, the short days of as we're getting into fall. I'm always jealous of the fall that the Midwest has, versus us. We probably get, well, we're having a pretty good fall this year, but a couple good weeks, and then we can really drop off temperature-wise, the middle to latter part of September. And so basically, ideally you want to get it planted before the end of May so that you're not harvesting into late September, October.
So I think the acreage trends in North Dakota, correct me if I'm wrong, they kind of mirror what we're facing here in Kansas. Are you seeing a decline in acres the past decade up there?
Yes. We probably, I kind of just ran some quick numbers compared to the 5-year average. Like I said, we're at about 6.5 million planted. Spring wheat was about 5.6, and our 5-year average is right at 6 million acres. For durum, we're anywhere, most years, 800,000 to 900,000 acres. Our 5-year average is about 1 million. So we're down, 10% from some of those levels. And if you go way back, 10, 15 years ago, there probably was close to 7 million acres of spring wheat, 1.5 million acres of durum. So, and probably similar to your region. I mean, part of it's just price competition, especially after the 2021 drought. Growers up here have the luxury of growing multiple crops. We can grow, malt barley. We grow some oats. We have a lot of edible beans, canola, of course, corn and soybeans, and flaxseed. And so what happened in the 21 drought is a lot of those specialty crops kind of got short in supply as well. And obviously not a lot of alternatives. So they pushed prices quite hard going into planting, which did cut into both corn and spring wheat acres. And then the other trend is, I think, because of labor issues, trying to spread out harvest risk a little bit, and then the soil health benefits and the push to bring more crops into the rotation for those aspects. Producers are finding that they like rotation, amongst their crops. So, even though we'd like to get back to some of those levels we had on wheat, I think it's just going to be a big challenge because, a lot of producers, half their acres are into oil seeds or pulse crops. The other half is wheat, malt barley, and then corn if you're in an area that can grow corn. So that crop competition isn't going away. And the other aspect is farmers have found some benefit in, I think our wheat crops have been healthier, less disease pressures as we've rotated some of those acres. And, a lot of producers in the West, some of them used to be, wheat on wheat, for a long period. And now they've kind of cut back where, like I said, I think we've got a pretty good balance of rotation in our crops.
Do you anticipate more soybean acre pressure in the eastern part of the state. I know there's a lot of new crush plants going in the United States, and that's going to cause probably some more competition.
Yeah, that's actually a very timely debate and discussion right now. But you're right, there is a lot of investment going into plants for the soybean crushing. And, right now, soybeans are, if you take our 22 to 24 million acres of crop, soybeans has been close to 7 million acres some years already. So they're already counting for a pretty good share. We have about, 1.5 2 million acres of canola. There's, some of those oil seeds can go in for that renewable diesel. And so, yeah, that is what the kind of the projection is over the next, 5 to 10 years, is we are going to see a further increase in soybean acreage, canola acreage, and that's going to put pressure on both wheat and corn. There is kind of an upside to that. One is, October, November, we typically face a lot of rail competition, space competition at the local elevators going to the P&W for export of soybeans. Well, if we're crushing all those soybeans here locally, there's obviously going to be an excess of soybean meal. So we're seeing a lot of discussion on trying to ramp up our livestock feeding in the state to use that, as well as, are they going to be railing soy meal or soy meal pellets out to the P&W? And a lot of our elevators have been set up for shuttle trains, meaning, loading the wheat, soybeans for long distance shipment. And so some of them are obviously facing some pressures with, the local crush plants taking some of their annual handle just because producers are going to sell it locally.
Yeah, there may be a lot of soybean meal going to South America here in the next 10 years or so. So
yeah, it'll be interesting. And like I said, I think competition is good for all because, producers are going to need a grass rotation on those acres. They can't just like, wheat on wheat, was challenging. And producers have done it. I know some guys that have grown soybeans for multiple years and not had any issues, but soybean cyst nematode is creeping up into our region. That can be an issue. And just harvest, just like Kansas. Wheat does well in our state. Producers still like growing wheat because they can get it in a little bit earlier, get it harvested sooner. So I think wheat will always compete. It's just probably going to require some higher prices, especially during planting, to make sure those acres go in.
There's a little bit of a friendly competition between Kansas and North Dakota, who's going to grow the most wheat in the United States, and North Dakota is going to carry that title easily this year because of our drought. But there are some big differences. For the benefit of those maybe not familiar with the northern plains, in the southern plains here, our elevator grain handling system was designed to handle a lot of wheat in a big hurry, and the farmer was rewarded for the amount of bushels they have. Now that's changing and evolving a little bit slowly, more towards, I think, what you have in the northern plains. So tell us, exactly what's the difference in how farmers raise, store, segregate, and receive pricing for spring wheat.
Yeah, so up here in North Dakota, and I would say, well, probably all 4 states, Montana, Minnesota, South Dakota, and part of it, I think, is because of our climate. We're able to have a lot of on-farm storage, and typically with just air fans, we can kind of maintain that quality through the fall and winter. Part of it's probably because we're at the tail end of the harvest, and when Kansas is blessed with a lot of good rains, which I know they weren't this year, and they're able to have a big harvest and of course collapse the prices for the rest of us up here north, then we have to store it. No, it's I think historically because of our climate, and also probably just because of our later harvest, we do have a lot of on-farm storage. And so unlike down there, there's probably some pre-contracted bushels that'll be shipped to the elevator at harvest. And then depending on prices or, how big the corn or soybean crop might be and what space producers need for that, they'll haul some to town at harvest as well. But some years we can have 70% of it stays on the farm in farm storage. And part of it is to bring it into condition if it's a little bit high on moisture. Most guys will certainly push green and try to take it off a little bit wet to preserve quality and then get it in some air bins to bring it down to marketable moisture. The other is protein. Has always been a big pricing point for hardwood spring wheat. The majority of our contracts with international customers are 13.5 protein or higher. And so if a producer doesn't have that coming into harvest and elevators are trying to fill trains for some pre-sold contracts to the Pacific Northwest or the Gulf and they're needing to meet that protein, we can get some pretty serious pricing for protein. And I just look for this year now, and part of it's because the southwest part of our state had basically they outproduced the amount of nitrogen they had in the ground. There is some 11 and 12 protein wheat. And so the discounts on that for protein are it's 40 cents a bushel from or a point of protein from 14 to 13, and then down to 12 it's another 40 cents, and then if you're at 11 protein you take another 80 cents off. So you're basically $1.60 from the $6.50 board price for 11 protein. So it's probably pricing it below hardwood winter. And the reason is simply that we have no demand right now for 11, 12 protein. And so the contracts the elevators are having to fill is that higher protein. We do have some premiums on the upside, but that's only worth about, I think it's 5 cents a fifth, 8 cents a fifth. So, you're gaining some premium on the upside. But in the other issue, we've struggled with fusarium or WOYM periodically. In a lot of our markets, we have some buyers like Japan. We ship some to Italy where they're down to 1 to 1.2 parts per million is the maximum they'll take. So some years dawn can be a pretty brutal pricing point. And of course, the other falling number, we generally haven't had test weight issues. So the typical, when a producer's planting wheat, like I said, a lot of times they've been hesitant to pre-sell too much because most of the contracts of the elevator are subject to market scale of discounts at time of delivery. So obviously you can lock in basis, you can lock in futures, but it's the Wild West when it comes to what potential discounts could be is if you don't make 13.5 protein, less than 2 parts per million dawn. And then the other factor which is showing up this year is what we call DHV or vitreous kernels. We still have some of our Pacific or Asian customers who buy off the Pacific Northwest will specify 60% vitreous kernel or higher. Well, with some of the sluggish harvest, some of the lower protein, some of the rains at harvest, vitreous is lower than typical. So that could be another pricing point that shows up. So producers like to store it on the farm and segregate it by protein. If they have some high dawn wheat, they may separate that in a separate bin and then just haul it in, late fall through the winter months and hopefully try to manage some of those discounts that can show up.
Is there more on-farm storage than commercial storage?
I'd have to look that up, but yeah, it might be pretty close. I know when we have international visitors, we always say we can store 3 years worth of a wheat crop on farm.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's pretty significant. And now with corn moving into our region, obviously there's a lot bigger bins that have been produced. So just like the elevators when they transitioned over to shuttles, they were somewhat limited on how much segregation they could do then, because a lot of older elevators were set up to segregate probably by a half point of protein and by grade, and then you have your feed wheat. But now, as you got shuttles, basically maybe you can only do 3 segregations. So farms are starting to be a little bit restricted that way too. A lot of the storage that's been put up is pretty large volume, so they're not able to segregate it like they did probably 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah, there's a lot of protein in the market this year, especially here in hard red winter wheat country, and so that probably hasn't helped on your upside on protein either.
You bring up a good point, because there's been a lot of economic studies on what drives protein scales. Is it the average protein in the winter wheat crop? Is it our average protein? Is it the protein in the Canadian crop? And of course, the answer is always somewhere in the middle. It's a little bit of everything. But you're right. Because of your unfortunate droughts the last couple of years, you've had higher protein. And so I think that's one of the things that's catching up with us this year is, we haven't had protein premiums or discounts the last couple of years. We've averaged 14 to 14 and a half for a crop protein. And so farmers have started to subtly shift to what we call some of our higher yielding, lower protein varieties. And this year it caught up with some of them that, they're just not going to make the standard of 13, 14 protein. And so I think hopefully we'll see a shift back next year into some more of those, varieties that are known for a little bit higher protein. But no, you're right. If the winter wheat crop has protein, that kind of tempers the demand from the domestic mills a little bit. And then we kind of need to see what happens on the international front. And I haven't heard much out of the Canadian crop, but that's obviously a big factor too. If they're short on protein, then they'll come to the U.S. because, there's just not a lot of places that produce a lot of 14, 15 protein wheat around the world.
Well, both spring wheat and hard red winter have rationed export demand pretty well this year. But remind us from North Dakota what your major export markets are, and on a normal year, how much of your wheat would you export?
Yeah, we always say, 50-50, and obviously that's going to vary by state. Montana is much more locked into the international market. Probably 70, maybe 75% of their production will go export. But 50% is kind of a good catch for us. And the Philippines is the dominant market. Some years, they can count for almost 25% of our exports. And just the pandesal type bread they're making, a lot of the smaller bakeries, they just really like the absorption, the strength, or the oven spring they get out of hard red spring wheat. So a very key traditional market. Japan's been a long-time customer of both hard red winter, hard red spring. Of course, on the spring side, they've got their blends set up where they like, Canadian spring wheat as well for some of the intangibles it brings in terms of extensibility. Our wheat's typically a little stronger. And then we have Taiwan and Korea have been long-time, very strong markets of hard red spring. Italy is where the bulk of our European demand goes. Some years Spain. And then as we go south, Guatemala has been a good market. The Caribbean, especially when tourism trade is back up, just a lot of the higher end hotels like the higher quality breads. And but the big story the last couple of years has been Mexico. We're the second largest customer last year. Sales to date since June 1. They're running about 25-30% ahead of a year ago already. And I think there's a couple dynamics there. One is, due to your drought, just hard red winter's been a little bit tighter availability, probably some relatively higher prices compared to spring wheat. And then we've been working very hard with the railroads to make sure that we are more competitive into Mexico, and I think we've seen some adjustments on some rail rates, and the mills have really, as you know, down there, really like buying rail direct shipments if they can, just for consistent quality. And where our competition is getting into Mexico, ironically, is out of Vancouver, Canada. They can come around, on the Pacific, come in the water, and even some customers, in South America can get Canadian wheat cheaper than we can, kind of railing it to the Gulf and then putting it on the water. So we've been very fortunate that, Mexico has picked up the slack that we've seen in Asia and parts of Europe the last couple of years.
Yeah, I think we can both agree. Thank goodness for Mexico on a free trade agreement. That's kind of the only game in town for hard red winter this year. Well, it's a nice segue. You talked about transportation and railroads. You've worn the hat. You've played a big role in what's called the Wheat Transportation Group with U.S. Wheat Associates. So we have to certainly talk about the merger of is it Canadian Pacific and Kansas City Southern? Or am I getting those two correct?
Yes.
And so that is your first direct line, essentially, from the Northern Plains and Canada down into Mexico. So what is North Dakota's perspective on that, good or bad?
You bring up a good point. And the CP-KCS merger, and I guess I give credit to where credit's due. I think, the hardwood winter wheat states, especially Kansas, Oklahoma, first started raising concerns on this, and led by, Justin in your state, and Dalton with U.S. Wheat, that, as you said, if you look at a map, the CP Kansas City Southern merger, while it faced less scrutiny from the Surface Transportation Board because it was an end-to-end connection, so it's not really going to take away competition from competing railroads as previous mergers did. But for us in the wheat world, it basically just opened up a direct line potentially from the Canadian prairies straight into Mexico on a seamless route. And while on paper, KCS can say, well, we'll still give the same put-through agreements for the railroads coming out of the, hardwood winter wheat region or other regions to access our line. But any of us that know capitalism and competition, that's only going to go so far. So, but up here in North Dakota, so we were, as the Wheat Commission, we're supportive of U.S. Wheat's position that we just did not see any overwhelming benefit to it, and in terms just the bigger risk of allowing Canadian wheat to compete more directly into Mexico. Where we had a bit more of a challenge is about 30% of the wheat in North Dakota is originated on Canadian Pacific rail lines. So for those shippers, they were hoping to see some longer or some rate benefit and maybe some additional markets gained because they could get a longer haul on the CP as opposed to the CP having to hand it off somewhere. But I think the early read I've heard is those shippers have not really seen those benefits yet. And if anything, they're starting to be concerned about, in Canada, their shuttle system is designed for like 140 rail cars, whereas ours is the standard 110 to 120. Are they going to favor some of those shippers in Canada that are already built for that 140 shipment as opposed to North Dakota? And so I think they're starting to watch it closely, and also they did not see the improvement in the quality of rail cars, some of the service. In fact, CP Rail sometimes is discounted on shipments to the Pacific Northwest versus the Burlington Northern Railroad, just because of poor service and poor equipment. So yeah, it's definitely one we're going to watch going forward. I know the Burlington Northern UP, where they merge or access Mexico in the southern part of Texas, There's a lot of concern there of congestion, and also just are they going to get is CP KCS going to kind of stymie them with uncompetitive access rates to continue to serve Mexico? So in short, that might be why we're actually seeing some good sales to Mexico, is because I think we've seen the other railroads try to offset that a little bit and maybe be a little more aggressive to compete against the CPKCS.
Yeah, it's certainly interesting dynamics. A lot of things to watch going forward, and
exactly,
it's always changing. Well, in the time we have left, let's circle a little bit back closer to North Dakota and talk about some things going on in wheat research. I had the opportunity to come up to Fargo about a year ago, and you've got a beautiful new facility being built on North Dakota State University's campus. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it's called the Peltier Complex, and it was aptly named from a very beneficial donation from the Peltier family. But essentially what it is kind of merging our meat science, our grain science, at least from the quality end, and our Northern Crops Institute, which is similar to your IGP there in Kansas. And, as it goes with a lot of university buildings and in research, our wheat quality labs were very outdated. Some of the labs didn't even have running water. They had to set a receptacle kind of higher up and just let gravity flow to keep the water coming in some labs. So definitely needed an improvement, and the timing was right to get some matches. The Wheat Commission invested a significant amount of wheat checkoff dollars from producers into the match. We had a very good state funding. Our state reserves have been good the last couple of years, and so timing was right. And so, the concept is, the wheat quality labs will be there, and we've got some new equipment. Hopefully that will help, garner being able to bring in be more competitive for scientists and researchers, being able to do some higher end research, food quality type research, because we can control the environment in the labs a lot closer. Meat sciences will be a big benefactor of that. And so the facility is set up to handle, the meat processing. And then having the Northern Crops Institute in there will allow us to showcase a lot of this research to international visitors. And then, the milling actually got to be, one of the bigger discussion points, because as we know, with wheat, you need to mill it to kind of see what the flour quality is, baking quality. And so obviously we have some larger scale mills for bigger research projects and smaller scale. So, I guess we'll see going forward as we try to meld some of those together, how that operates. But we're very excited about it because, like I said, it's long overdue and scheduled to be ready by the spring of 2024. And just see where that takes us. And, probably like all universities, the agricultural side of it is struggling a little bit with enrollment right now. I think part of it's just, less farm kids or, I guess, coming to the university. There's definitely a lot of openings on the ag industry side, but that is one of the struggles right now. And maybe with some newer facilities, competing for researchers internationally and nationally, hopefully that'll be a drawing card too to help boost up enrollments.
Yeah, it's really great to see that investment in grain science and feed science, not only in North Dakota State, but we've got a project here at K-State planned, and even Oklahoma State building a new building. So it's about time, I guess I would say. So, speaking of research, hit on a few highlights of what your research priorities are from your commission standpoint.
So in North Dakota, we generally have our research planning kind of February, March of each year, hear the new requests and review of the old programs. We invest about roughly $1.5 million per year in wheat research from wheat checkoff dollars, and the vast majority of that goes into our wheat breeding programs and their the quality testing programs that go with that. So we have a hard red spring wheat program. Dr. Andrew Green, who is an alumni of K-State, heads up that program. And we also fund a Durham breeding program. And the Durham breeding program is the largest public one in the U.S. And for some programs, they're more dependent on wheat producer checkoff funds as compared to state general funds or federal grants, federal funds. We also fund a hard red winter wheat program, and that's obviously a lot smaller scale compared to the others. But then, with those breeding programs, it's very important for us that quality stays at the forefront. So early on in the generations, we're providing funding where they can do testing on the milling and bake quality, dough strength parameters, on Durham looking at the pasta quality, and all that takes time and resources and investment. But we feel it is an advantage we have over the privates. But in the last couple of years, we've seen an increase in demand for research related to soil health. One of the other issues we're fighting in some areas that have had long time no-till is low pH soils. And so we're doing research into adding lime to the soils, to try to boost that a little bit. I know there's some varieties that are being tested to that have a little more tolerance to the acidic soils. And then, we obviously do a lot of germplasm exploration, looking for, leaf rust. And a new challenge that's come into our region is what we call bacterial leaf streak. Fungicides do not work on it, and a lot of our current varieties do not have tolerance to that. So that's kind of been a new focus for our plant pathologists as well as our wheat breeders.
Yeah, and fortunately, pathologists never have a dull job, do they? Always something new coming up. So.
Yeah, first it was the UG99 was going to wipe out everything. Well, now that's, there's always something new every year. Fortunately, we've gotten ahead of the Fusarium head blight. The National Wheat and Barley Scab Initiative was extremely helpful in that, but also just one of our previous checkoff increases was tied to increased funding to combat Fusarium head blight. So I think, as I know you guys do down there, I think that's one thing that producers, even in periods when we're struggling international marketing-wise and, probably questioning, what is the long-term viability of competing with, Russia just dumping wheat on the world market and setting the prices, that investment in research, I think, has just been phenomenal and paid tremendous dividends in solving issues. And you can have federal and state dollars, which are definitely helpful, but those producer checkoff funds, I think, can help stop the immediate bleeding and then also really just kind of drive and direct the overall program.
Well, Jim, that's great. Thanks for sharing with us. It's always good to get a perspective from another state and see the opportunities and challenges you have. So thanks for joining us.
Yes, thanks for the opportunity.
My thanks to Jim Peterson from the North Dakota Wheat Commission for joining us on Wheats on Your Mind. Remember, if you have a topic you'd like us to cover in the future or have a question for one of our guests, please email us at podcast@kswheat.com. I'm Aaron Harries. Thanks for listening.